Hello, I'm Ben Warwick, and I'm a lecturer in law at the University of Birmingham. And the reason I'm talking to you today via video link is unfortunately I can't be there in the room. But Tracy and I agreed that we'd try this slightly odd thing where I talk to a screen and you hear it in a different time period. Um, and the reason I'm talking to you is about a year ago, with some undergraduate students at Durham University, we decided to put together a report to contribute to a UN Human Rights Committee process, which was examining the UK's progress on various social and economic issues over the last 8 years. And this committee, it's known as the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, examines the UK for things like its progress in the right to food, the right to health, the right to housing, and importantly in this context, the right to social security. And this body is constituted by international law. It monitors an international treaty which the UK has been a part of since the 1980s. It's signed up to that voluntarily. And many countries around the world are party to this treaty as well. So it's got clout, and it's a fairly important process to be fed into. And with these students, we kind of focused in on sanctions, especially in the northeast of England, and how they were affecting individuals' human rights. And it wasn't hard to find lots of ways in which they affected individuals' human rights. But rather than tell you what we kind of found and what we thought, I thought it better to focus on what the committee found, because they're the important ones after all. And this committee produces at the end of this process. So the process is lots of charities and government bodies submit their progress report, kind of their view on how the government's been doing. And then there's an examination process, an oral examination with the UK. And in the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights produces a report that's known as Concluding Observations. And I put that report online for you. It's at bit.ly.com, bitly.com /UKCO16. And in that report, you'll see lots of different things going on, but one of the strongest parts of that report, in my view, is where the committee talks about the UK's disastrous record on the right to social security, and that's around paragraph 40 and 41. And in that part of the report, the committee talks about being deeply concerned about the various changes being made. It mentions the bedroom tax, it mentions the benefit cap, it mentions the particular impacts upon low-income families, women, children, persons with disabilities, and it mentions that it's concerned about the extent of the use of sanctions. And the way in which it mentions sanctions, I think, is particularly important. Because unlike with some of the other things it discusses in that paragraph, where it focuses in on the social impact, that would be the normal trend for this committee to focus on the social and economic impact. So the impact upon people's income and living standards, whether they've got an adequate standard of living in their language. With sanctions, it focuses more on the absence of due process and the absence of the access to justice for people affected by sanctions. I think that's particularly important, and perhaps a steer that maybe we should take up. That the committee has found it easier to focus in on the more justice-oriented things, the more kind of adjudicatory process style things, rather than focusing on how it affects people's standard of living. And that might just be, it's more simple for them to state the impact in terms of access to justice and due process, but it's certainly thought-provoking that they've gone down that road. Also in this report, the committee focus on a number of recommendations, and I'll pick out the ones that they've made in relation to sanctions. So it requires that the UK reviews the use of sanctions. So I think that's a first strong starting point. The committee are looking for a review, and to me that says all-encompassing, take stock of what's working, what's not, the disasters that are currently in the system and do something about them. So I think there's a strong recommendation there. But the committee then digs down into more detail, and they pick out that they want the sanctions to be used proportionately. So in other words, that the sanction matches the infraction that the sanctions in relation to, so that you don't have a massive sanction for something that was very minor, or using sanctions for things that are just not appropriate to sanction. So that's one point they're looking at. They're looking for that kind of relationship between the sanction and the offence, if you like, to be proportionate. But they're also, again, returning to this point of process and talking about dispute mechanisms that are prompt and independent. So where there's a dispute between the person who's been sanctioned and the person who's made the sanction, that can be reviewed quickly and independently. Again, picking up something, an unease that plenty of people have had, that this isn't happening at present. So I think that's another interesting recommendation that can be taken forward. Very often people kind of ignore or don't quite see the relevance of reports like this from treaty bodies like this one. So I suppose the next steps, or the ways that this can be used, I would mention a few. First, that there's a kind of an authority or an importance that can come with mentioning that the UN, in inverted commas, it's actually, a small committee within the UN, but people tend to talk about the UN saying that the UK should review its use of sanctions, and that carries a certain weight, a certain authority that can make people take up and sit and take notice, whether that's people in the media or in authority. So the first thing I'd say about next steps and how to use this is to use it. And I've seen it used most often tagged on to something else. So if you're writing a letter to a local representative, if you're organising an event, if you're starting a petition, that this is mentioned, that the UN has taken the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has taken a stance on this. They've said that the UK should review the use of sanctions. They've said that they're deeply concerned about some of the changes that the UK is currently enacting in relation to social security. So I think using that authority is a good move. In practice, I think that weight is most likely to be effective at lower levels of government. So I think probably in more junior positions, junior ministers, perhaps even more so at council level or at the devolved level, you'll see policymakers, decision makers taking more note of it. Partly because when you get to the higher levels of Department of Work and Pensions, they're likely to know that they can fob this off and ignore it. So that would be the first thing. Use it at slightly lower levels, I think, are the most successful strategies. Other things I'd say about what to do next and how to use this is to keep recording case studies. Certainly when we were putting the report together, being able to talk to Tracy at length and to have the examples and her expertise and so many different ways in which the sanctions were affecting people, and being able to put those into the report, I think most likely had a big impact. It's very often with this sort of thing, not just about numbers, it's about showing the story and how the numbers combine, if you like. It's all very well saying a percentage have been affected in this way, but if you can kind of show how all those different effects pile up on people, I think those are the most poignant and most effective case studies. So I'd say keep recording those case studies. There are periodic reviews of this, and that leads to my next point, which is to follow the work of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, if you don't already. They're kind of the independent body within the UK that monitor this sort of thing. They'll most likely they did in the past anyway, put together a mid-report. So in, I'd say, about 2-3 years, they'll put together a report saying, well, what progress has the UK made? It's had these recommendations from the UN committee. Has it done anything about them? And it kind of holds the UK's feet to the fire in that middle period, where there's a while to go before the next review, which will be in about 5 years. But in that middle period, they tend to put together another report. So at that point, they'll put out a call for evidence and that sort of thing. So it's worth watching what they're doing, and follow them on Twitter and sign up to any mailing lists they have. And it's those then case studies that can feed into what they're doing and then influence their work as well. There are a few other things as well, but I fear I'm running out of time. I also feel slightly guilty that I'm not in the room to take questions. But if you have any questions on either this UN process or the report that they produced, or the report that we produced with the students and with Tracy's help, I'm more than happy to answer them. My email address is btcw@me.com. So if you have any questions, drop me a line. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. But otherwise, I hope you have a really productive day there, and thank you very much for listening.